Hey, what's up everybody? Adam here, and today I'm talking about 4 basic chord progressions that every jazz musician should know. I'm talking about chord progressions that show up again and again in Great American Songbook standards, in jazz standards, in tunes that we learn as we learn this music in general. And so we're going to be covering 4 of the most crucial chord progressions that once we can identify and treat as a progression, so that we're not just thinking this chord, this chord, this chord, but as a whole, it just makes it so much easier to improvise, so much easier to accompany if you're a pianist or a guitarist or a vibraphonist, and we just don't have to think as much. So let's get to it. The way that we're going to learn these 4 chord progressions is key. These are ways that jazz musicians have been learning these progressions for decades. We're going to start with some melodic content. And not just any melodic content. There's tons of ways to make melodic content out of these basic chord progressions, but we're going to focus on mixing scales and broken chords or arpeggios. And then the second way is we're going to learn basic voicings. And not just voicings that only pianists should know. If you're a jazz musician at all, you should know just a little bit how to create simple voicings. Get to a keyboard, hear them, try them out. And so we're going to focus on our patent pending root, shell, pretty. We're even going to do root, shell, double pretty for these. So stay tuned for that. And then at the end, the third prong of this trident of learning these basic 4 chord progressions is I'm going to invite a very special secret surprise guest to play through these chord progressions for you so that you can hear how not just a pro, but a master plays through these chord progressions. All right, let's jump in with our first chord progression. Before we get started though, let's just define what a chord progression is. It really is just a series of chords. It doesn't have to be anything special. It could be any chords, and they don't have to repeat in any kind of certain way or be any certain duration. It really is open. It's just a progression of chords. And we use the chord progression as, again, kind of looking up from above instead of looking at each chord individually. When chords are in a certain order, they tend to mean certain things, and then they've been used over and over and over again to get a certain sound. Okay, our first chord progression is kind of the king of chord progressions in jazz. It's the 1-6-2-5. In B flat, the root movement is B flat, G, which is the 6th tone up from B flat, C, which is the 2nd tone up from B flat, and F, which is the 5th tone up from B flat. You've heard this sound probably a million times. Right? Seem familiar? Now, if we make chords that are all diatonic, in other words, all in the key of B flat, using the notes in the key of B flat major, we get B flat major, 6 is what I'm going to play, not 7. We have G minor, we have C minor 7, and we have F7. Right? One of the common things that people first do to the 1-6-2-5 chord progression is instead of G minor 7 as the 2nd chord, they'll play a G7 chord as the 2nd chord, which has notes that are outside of the key of B flat, but they sound great. To C minor 7 to F7. Now, anytime we have a 7 chord, like a G7 or an F7, a dominant 7 chord, we can alter the extensions. And by extensions, I'm talking about the 9th, 11th, and 13th. So in our chord progression here, I'm going to alter those dominant chord extensions. For the G7, I'm going to use a G7 flat 13, flat 9. We have our C minor 7, which is all diatonic, all notes that are in the key of B flat. And for the F7, we'll use F7. Oh, let's use F natural 13 with a flat 9. It sounds complicated, but it's really just the 9th of F is flatted. And same thing with the G7. The 9th is flatted. The 13th, which is E, is flatted. Okay, let's play our melodic line to outline this chord progression. Our first 2 beats is our B flat major 6. Our second 2 beats is the G7. Our first 2 beats of the 2nd measure is the C minor 7. And the second 2 beats of that measure is the F7. And then we land on our B flat 7. And that's just a little language. That's just something slick I kind of like. So again, it sounds like this. Right? That's a pretty standard way to outline some chord changes. But what's happening there? So we have just a B flat major scale going up. And when we get to our 3rd beat of the 1st measure, our G7, I'm literally just doing a G7 chord broken, starting from the 7th going down. On the C minor 7, I'm doing another broken chord, but I'm doing it in a different way. This is a C minor 7 inverted. It's second inversion, starting on G, right? All the same notes as C minor 7, C, E flat, G, and B flat, but just taken down with G on the bottom. So I'm taking that shape and I'm breaking it up. This is so crucial to learning these chord progressions and why it's great to be around a piano or a keyboard. When you learn these inversions, then you can break them up in your melodic lines. Anything you want to do, those combinations of 4 notes all of a sudden become super, super flexible for what we want to do with our melodic content. Okay, so again, the first bar and a half is B flat, G7, C minor 7, and then our F7 flat 9. Whoa, what is that? So that's part of the F half-whole diminished scale. Whenever we have a dominant 7 chord with a flat 9, we can use what's called the half-whole diminished scale. In F, it's a half step starting on F, then a whole step, then a half step, then a whole step. And that pattern is repeated all the way till you get back to F. So this is part of that scale. D, C, B natural, A, and then we're back to B flat. The great part about this is it really helps us outline that B flat. It's what's called an enclosure. And then a little bit of slick language that I love. Okay, so let's hear that line again for our 1, 6, 2, 5. Pretty slick. Okay, now we need to learn some basic voicings so that we can hear this chord progression when we sit down at a keyboard, no matter what instrument we play. We're going to use our root shell pretty system that I've talked about in previous videos. This is a simple concept that has just a wealth of possibilities. The first rule of the root shell pretty is to put the root and the shell in your left hand. For our B flat major 6 chord, that's B flat and then our 3rd and our 6th, right? Because the shell, we're calling the shell the 3rd and the 7, or the 3rd and the 6th in this case. It's either the 7th or the 6th, but it's always the 3rd. So here we have B flat, D, and G, the 6th, in the left hand. And then we have 2 pretty notes in the right hand. The pretty notes are usually the 9th, or the 11th, or the 13th, or the 5th. And in this B flat major 6 voicing, we're going to do the 9th and the 5th. All right, so I have from the bottom up in the left hand, B flat, D, G, root, 3rd, and 6th. And in the right hand, I have C and F, the 9th and the 5th. That is one solid voicing. And don't let anybody tell you that you can't have roots in your voicing. Roots are a part of piano voicings in jazz. Always have been, always will be, as long as I have anything to say about it. Okay, so that's our B flat major 6 chord. For our G7, remember we're going to use a flat 13, which the 13 of G is E. So we're going to flat that. And we're going to use a flat 9, which the 9 of G is A. We're going to flat that, so we have, instead of E and A, we have E flat and A flat as our pretty notes. Our shell is going to be, well, our root is going to be G, obviously, but our shell is going to be F, the 7th, and B, the 3rd. On dominant chords, the 7th is always flat. It's always a flat 7. So that would always be F natural on a G7, and then a B major, a B natural, on a dominant 7 as well. Always the major 3rd, minor 7. And then again, our pretty notes, our flat 13 and our flat 9. Now, voicings don't exist in a vacuum, progressions don't exist in a vacuum, so we have our B flat going to our G7, flat 9, flat 13. All right, next we have our C minor 7. We have our root, C, and then we have our shell, 3rd and 7, E flat and B flat in our left hand. For our pretty notes, we're going to use the 9 and the 5th. This is very convenient because those are just a half step below our E flat and A flat. The 9 of C is D, and the 5th is G. So from the bottom up, C, E flat, B flat, the 9, D, and the 5th G in the right hand. So here's how those 3 chords sound together already. You hear where we're going. There's a little half step movement going down here that we're going to resolve. Our F7 is the next chord, and we have F in the left hand, and then the 7th, remember it's always a minor 7 on dominant chords, so E flat, and then a major 3rd, A. Our pretty notes on the F7. Remember, we can alter any of the any of the 9th, 13th, 11th, whatever we want to on the dominant chords. And so we're going to do a flat 13 and a flat 9. This is just like the G7, but moved down a whole step. So from the bottom up, we have F, E flat, A, and then we have D flat and G flat, the flat 13 and flat 9. Now, if you can't reach this 10th, you can certainly grab it with the thumb of your right hand and do 2 in the left and 3 in the right. Let's hear what we have so far. B flat, G7, C minor 7, F7. And then we just go back to B flat, right? How many times have we heard that? That's all over the place. So that's our 1, 6, 2, 5. Great. You can get around so many tunes with just that progression. I encourage you to take it through many different keys. Practice that melodic line, practice those voicings in different keys, try different inversions. It's all good. Okay, our next chord progression is a bit of a shorter chord progression, but it's one that you see all the time. This is 1 going to a 4 chord. But between the 1 and the 4, we change the 1 from a major chord to a dominant chord, taking it out of the original key just slightly, putting it into that key of the 4. In B flat, we have B flat major 6, sounds familiar, and then we're going to do B flat 7, a dominant chord, going to E flat major 6, right? You've heard this a million times too. If we're in B flat, right? It's just the way to get to the 4 chord. In jazz, we love to put these dominant chords between chords so that we kind of have a place to lead our ears to. Okay, so the way that we're going to play this progression is a B flat major 6, and then a B flat 7, flat 13, sharp 9. Bam! Some people call that the altered. We're definitely going to be using the altered scale for this, and then we're going to go to an E flat major 7 or major 6, whatever you prefer. That's the sound though. We're in the key of B flat, going to the major. Okay, the melodic line that we'll use to outline the chord is pretty hip. We have our B flat major 6, B flat major 7 arpeggio, D, F, A, and then the 9th C. And then we'll do our B flat, sharp 9 flat 13. We have a little turn there with the sharp 9, major 3rd, back to the sharp 9, flat 9, and then just part of the scale. So you could think about this as just, right? Which is that B flat altered scale. Sorry, that's the altered scale there. Going to that E flat major 6. It's a sound we hear all the time. All right, so our line so far is B flat major 6 for 2 beats, and then our B flat altered for 2 beats, altered or sharp 9 flat 13, however you want to call it, and then E flat major 7. So this, it doesn't sound like a scale, right? But it is. It's just those 4 notes of E flat, G, F, E flat, and D, the 3rd, 2nd, root, and 7th, but I've broken it up. That way we get more of a melodic break than just playing it straight up or down. Okay, so the whole progression sounds like this melodically. It's a very quick cadence, but it happens all the time. The voicings for our second progression are picking up right where we left off from the first one. We have our B flat major 6 with B flat, D, G, right, root, and shell in our left, and then our pretty notes, the 9 and the 5, C and F. For our B flat 7 altered, or B flat 7 sharp 9 flat 13, we have the root and the shell. This is a dominant chord, so we have B flat, the major 3rd D, the minor 7th, A flat, and then we have our sharp 9, D flat, our flat 13, G flat, and then I'm going to just throw the root on because I like this voicing a lot. We have one more note, just the root at the top. So we have the root at the top and the bottom, and the meat of the chords in there. So B flat, D, A flat, D flat, G flat, B. Again, it sounds like this together. Woo, that sounds nice. And then we're going to a very simple E flat major 6. E flat, G the 3rd, C the 6th, our 9, F, and our 5. Altogether, the 3 chords sound like this. Got it? Okay, for our third crucial chord progression, every jazz musician should know, we're going to go from the 4 chord to the sharp 4 diminished to the 1 chord over the 5. That was a lot of words, but you hear this sound all the time. Right? Super common in so many songs. So we'll start with our 4 chord, which is E flat, right where we left off, that E flat major 6. And then we'll do an E diminished 7. Right? Diminished chords are simply built on minor thirds. So E, G, B flat, D flat. And then that root movement goes up to the F, which is the 5th of B flat. And we have B flat over F. This is a slash chord, meaning that the first letter of the chord is the top of the chord, or B flat chord, and the bass note is an F. So it's just like a B flat 7 chord, but with the bass note being an F. Right? So we have E flat, E diminished, B flat over F. Very common, you hear it all the time. Our melodic line for this is so cool because it uses part of that scale that we ended our last chord progression off of on the E flat. Remember that broken scale? And then we outline the diminished chord in minor thirds, literally just E diminished going up. And then we do this little scalar lick on the B flat over F. That's again, just some slick language I like. Right? So it sounds like this. Kind of sounds like bebop. All right. Ooh, spoiler alert. All right, so our voicings for this third chord progression pick up again right where we left off. We have our E flat major 6 with our root and shell in the left hand, our pretty notes, the 9th and the 5th in the right hand. All right. I get asked all the time, how do I make a diminished voicing? Our next chord is a diminished chord. Well, it's the same concept. We have our root and shell, E, and then the G and the D flat, right? Kind of our 3rd and 7th of the diminished. And then we add pretty notes. Well, what are the pretty notes in the diminished chord? Do we just use other notes from that 4-note voicing of E, G, B flat, and D? We do not. Because of the way the diminished chord is built, it's built off the diminished scale. And the diminished scale in this case is E, F sharp, G, A, B flat, C, C sharp, D sharp, E. All of those extra notes that are not in that chord are the pretty notes. So that leaves us an entirely other diminished chord as our option. F sharp diminished. You can use any of the notes from the diminished chord a whole step above. So here we have in our left hand our root and shell, E, G, D flat. This already outlines the diminished chord for us. We're going to add 2 notes from that F sharp diminished, which we can borrow at any time. We're going to add F sharp and A. How gorgeous is that? So E, G, D flat, F sharp, A. Coming from that E flat 6th, right? For our slash chord, for our B flat over F, we're literally going to play F in the left hand and then a B flat major 7 chord all in the left hand. And we're just going to take our right hand and come down to the F so that we have what we call a block chord. It's all within an octave. I have the octaves outlined here. So F, A, B flat, D, F, right? It's just the B flat major 7 with that F doubled on top. I chose it because I think it sounds great in this particular chord progression. Always use your ears. Your ears will guide you to the right thing at all times. And I even like to slide down on that little, I think it's just good voice leading. Okay, those are our first 3 crucial chord progressions that every jazz musician should know. We have one more, and then I'm going to bring my special guest on to play through these in a very special way. You might have noticed that if you're at all familiar with the chord changes to George Gershwin's I Got Rhythm, That's what we're playing today. All of these chord progressions are taken out of rhythm changes, which is the changes from George Gershwin's I Got Rhythm. So we've had our 2/5. Then our 1 going to the 4. Now from the 4 back to the 1. That's the first A section of rhythm changes. So our very last chord progression that is crucial to know is going to be the bridge to rhythm changes, the B section. And that's a series of dominant chords that goes in fourths. Now, this is great for rhythm changes, but this also happens all over the place in several tunes in the Great American Songbook and in jazz. It's just a crucial thing to know because it's not as obvious. It's not as like harmonically obvious where these go. But I have some tips here that I think can help. So the bridge to rhythm changes will start on D7. It's a dominant chord, D7. And then it just goes up in fourths or down in fifths in a cycle of 4 chords. G7, C7, F7. Again, starting on D, G, C, F, up in fourths like that. And they're all dominant chords. So it doesn't sound very grounded. It sounds very ambiguous. Back to B flat for the last A. Okay, what do we do with this? What did I just do? Well, one of the things that can help ground you is to use what we call a tritone substitution. Whenever we're moving in fourths like this from one tonic center to the other, we can use a tritone sub as a way to get there and a way to cause this half-step movement from the top down. So here we're on D7. And when I say tritone sub, I mean at any point when we're playing this D7, we can then play an A flat 7, which is a tritone away from the root of D, A flat. Right, here's our D7 with our root in the shell. If we do A flat, it's the same shell. The 3rd and the 7 of D, F sharp and C, is actually the 7th and the 3rd of A flat, G flat and C. And that is perfect into the G7, right, which is G, F, C. The tritone of G is D flat, and again, the shell, the 7 and 3 of G, F and B, is perfect for D7, D flat 7, because it's the 3rd and 7th, F and C flat. And that goes into C. The tritone sub of C is G flat, tritone away. Again, the same shell. So when you just hear the root movement of these tritone subs and you keep the shell, you get a real good understanding of why this works so well. Tritone sub, C7, tritone sub, G flat to F. And then we get that great, step from a half step above. So again. It's such a classic sound in this music. Okay, so what can we do harmonically? We have 2 bars of D7 here. Well, we could play a bar and a half of it, which is what I've done, and then we play A flat 7. So our melodic line goes. Right, that is A flat 7. So I have I have a bar and a half, 6 beats of D7. Right, up the scale, down the arpeggio, up the scale, and then A flat 7 in the G7. And you can just repeat this because it ends on the same chord pitch as it starts. It'll work in a cyclical way. What are the voicings we can use to outline? Well, it's very simple. Root and shell, obviously. Root and shell pretty. D, F sharp, and C natural, because it's a dominant chord. Remember, major 3rd, minor 7th. And then our pretty notes, the 9th and the 13th. For A flat, we have our root, A flat, 7th, G flat, right? The same shell as the D flat. You can switch to your right hand, again, if you can't reach the 10ths. The A flat 10th is especially hard. So you can play 2 in your right, 3 in your left. Switch that. 2 in your left, 3 in your right. So. And then our pretty notes, the 13 and the 9 of A flat, F and B flat. And then just go through. However you want to use the rest of that chord progression is easy, it just takes it down in cycles. All right, those are all 4 of the chord progressions. Let's put them together in one chorus of rhythm changes. See if you can follow along. We're going to have this played by my friend and world-class jazz pianist, Peter Martin. Enjoy. That's the appropriate response, is woo, when something like that happens. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, and if you want more of these kinds of tutorials, don't forget to subscribe. For the PDF of everything I just played, check the link below, and until next time, happy practicing.